Welcome back to the Thinking Crypto podcast. With me today is Ron Hammond, who's Director of Government Relations at the Blockchain Association. Ron, great to have you back on.
Thanks, Tony. Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Ron, man, there is so much to talk about. We had a hearing yesterday. We have a hearing going on today. Tell us about this FTX SBF situation. Sam Bankman-Fried was arrested, and now you have the hearings. What are you seeing and what are you hearing?
Definitely. So what was really interesting about this whole situation, at least with the House hearing, again, the House hearing was yesterday. It was supposed to have John Ray, the current CEO of FTX, and then it was supposed to have Sam Bankman-Fried. And it took a long time for him to finally confirm that he was going to testify virtually, and public pressure as well from Maxine Waters, Patrick McHenry, and several others members of the Congress and the media as well. But after doing multiple interviews in the public with New York Times and DealBook and Twitter Space as well, SBF finally said, I'm going to testify in front of House Financial Services. He actually never ended up doing that, if you all know. He also never was able to confirm himself for the Senate Bank Committee hearing, which happened today here on Wednesday. And so that really threw a whole wrench to things because, at least at this point, the members of Congress on the House side for the House Financial Service Committee, they're a pretty engaged group on crypto. And I think we saw that from the John Ray testimony, and I'm happy to get into that in more detail. But SBF was the main driver for this hearing. They want to have him in the hot seat. They want to hear from the facts from John Ray, the man who came in after to fix this whole mess. But they also want to use that in the first panel. And the second panel was to get hard-hitting questions and to really pin down SBF. As we know now, that really all fell apart at the last minute when SBF was arrested hours before he's supposed to testify. And so some members of Congress are saying it's pretty odd timing-wise, especially considering that I know for a fact, and I was talking to many offices over the weekend, that they were working on some pretty hard-hitting questions for SBF and to just fact-find more. And I was really excited to see that. And I think it's really exciting to see the members of Congress, especially on the House side, again, saying we want to ask substantive questions. And they unfortunately get that opportunity with SBF, but they did that with John Ray, which is really exciting to see. But we have a long way to go, unfortunately, in this whole FTX saga.
Yeah, it was pretty revealing, some of the things John Ray mentioned, like they were using QuickBooks for their accounting. There was no financial structure, no CFO and so forth. So it was a bit of a mess. And then today you have Kevin O'Leary, and it was kind of weird that they brought in an actor from like the OC and Gotham and so forth. Weird crowd of people to bring in. Kevin, I understand, but tell us about what do you thought about what Kevin was saying, and as well as the actor, I forget his name escapes me.
Ben McKenzie, yeah, from the OC.
Ben McKenzie, yeah.
So what we saw is we see two different approaches to this whole situation. And again, recall the Democrats are in power both in the House and the Senate. So ultimately, they're the ones who kind of dictate how a hearing is supposed to be structured, who the witnesses are. Now, the Republicans are allowed to get witnesses as well. But sometimes, in the case of the House one, for example, they don't get as many witnesses. Usually 3 to 4 for Democrats. Republicans get 1. In the Senate, it's either 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats witnesses, and sometimes it's 3 Democrats, 1 Republican witness. So each side has a way to pick their own players in terms of these hearings. But at the same time, the Democrats are the ones ultimately who say what they want the hearing to be focused on. But the difference is that in the House, we had Patrick McHenry and Maxine Waters, the lead Republican and the lead Democrat, say this is a bipartisan hearing. We are going to work together and get to the bottom of this. In the Senate, we saw something different. We saw, as you mentioned, the actors, Kevin O'Leary, a professor from American University. We also saw a Cato Institute person. And we saw that hearing more about, is crypto even legitimate? Is this all a scam? And like that was the framing of that hearing. That hearing, ultimately, I don't believe actually they were really trying to get much of SBF or FTX folks to testify. I think they were just trying to have a narrative in place to saying, does crypto even have a future in the United States or at all? Or is this all a scam and a sham and should be either banned entirely or, which is a pretty unique narrative we're seeing now, should we just not regulate it to legitimize it? Because there's this growing thing that if you put regulation around something, it becomes part of everyday life or becomes safe for the average day person. And so what's happening recently on Capitol Hill is that we're seeing a lot of skeptical Democrats saying we shouldn't even regulate this anymore. Because we believe that if we regulate this, it's legitimate. And we don't think this is legitimate at all. And the FTX situation is just that reason. When we all know that it wasn't crypto that was behind this FTX downfall, this is actually a centralized actor who was utilizing fraud to scam investors as well as scam the American public and other folks, internationally as well, obviously. So I think it just contrasts to what we're seeing. Is we're seeing House Republicans, House Democrats just trying to fact find, whereas the House Democrats largely were just trying to say we shouldn't even touch this to begin with. And unfortunately, I think it's going to continue to 2023 with the Senate Democrats saying, this really isn't even worth our time, whereas the House Republicans, who are going to be in control, say, no, we should get regulation in place. There's a lot of things bipartisanly we can do. And the House Democrats are actually joining their efforts. So my hope is we can break through to Senate Democrats. But this hearing, unfortunately, in the Senate Democrats was not as fruitful as we were expecting. We didn't expect too much to begin with, candidly. But this was not about FTX. This is about crypto as a whole.
Yeah, and just this morning, Elizabeth Warren released a very anti-crypto bill. What are your thoughts about that? It seems like a lot of people, whether to be Republicans or Democrats, are not really on board with it.
Well, the difference is that Elizabeth Warren did get a Republican this time. And I think this is a sign that for a lot of folks on Capitol Hill, we need to be mindful that this is not a Republican or Democrat issue if you're for crypto, for example. But you don't have to be a Republican or Democrat necessarily to be anti-crypto. And usually it's, as I mentioned, typically what we're seeing is it comes along the lines of age. Those who are a little older tend to skew to be more skeptical, and those who are a lot younger tend to be more embracing of the technology, or at least wanting to engage in it on the regulatory side. My best example is that Elizabeth Warren is known as the biggest progressive in the Senate.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest progressives in the House is Richie Torres, who's from Brooklyn, the Bronx area. And he is one of the most critical Democrats of Gary Gensler. But he's also one of the most progressive members of the House Financial Services Committee. And so you don't have to be progressive to love or hate this. And then I think that contrast is important. But same goes to Republicans too, conservative or moderate. You doesn't matter where you fall in the spectrum. We're seeing now that folks like Roger Marshall from Kansas are joining Elizabeth Warren and saying, we believe that software developers and validators who operate blockchain nodes, for example, should be registered with FinCEN, with Treasury. Also, at the same time, we believe that banks are not allowed to do any business with any cryptocurrency or any company that utilizes anonymizing enhancing services. This can be Zcash, this could be mixers. There's a lot of things this could apply to. It's very broad, and that's the reason.
Right.
The good news is that this bill is not going to go anywhere. It's not going to pass. Congress is going to restart next year. But it is a concerning trend that we see a lot more folks, and now the Republican side, joining Elizabeth Warren's efforts. And we also have the head of Senate Banking saying we don't even need to regulate this space. And so our hope is that we can really break through and say, look, regulation is important. Yes, it legitimizes an industry, but we already have a lot of regulation on the books. We just have, a couple of things here and there, like on securities laws, for example, that just need to have some tweaks to make sure businesses know how to run and operate their businesses.
Yeah. So on the note of securities law, the folks who are part of the Financial Services Committee who oversee the SEC, they're going to be in the transition starting in January with Republicans in the House. And there's talks from folks like Representative Bill Huizenga, Tom Emmer, and so forth. What are you expecting they're going to do with Gary Gensler in the SEC?
So Gary Gensler has not come in front of the House Financial Services Committee at all this year. Actually, it's funny. He did come to the Capitol Hill to brief the House Democrats on the FTX situation. It was a closed-door meeting, and these kind of meetings are actually pretty common on Capitol Hill. It's a way for the regulators to say, hey, here's what happened, or here's what we saw from our purview. CFTC, actually, that meeting, that happened actually in public. That was a hearing that happened December 1st in front of the Senate Ag Committee, where Republicans and Democrats got to ask the CFTC what happened with the FTX situation. Well, Gary Gensler doesn't have that sort of transparency that we've seen, at least within the committee setting. Now, mind you, the Democrats on the committee are the ones who get to ask him to testify. So I think that they were watching more for their own, and it's very typical. Regardless of whoever is in charge, they always want to watch out for their own party. But transparency is important, and these hearings usually do occur once a year. This year did not occur. And so Republicans are chomping at the bit to have Gary Gensler testify in front of them. And a lot of them have very legitimate questions. But I will say it's not just the Republicans. We are seeing House Democrats, and a large majority of them recently taking a pretty adverse view of Gary Gensler. Again, I mentioned Richard Torres, but he did a letter actually last week.
Yeah.
And it was just him really calling out the SEC for failing here. We've seen a lot of transparency from the CFTC. They say, hey, we met with SPF 10 times. We had conversations on their application. The SEC, we know they were having conversations with SPF. They were going to get a no action letter or no action relief for potentially registering their exchange with the SEC. Again, this is all public. Wall Street Journal had an article about it.
Right.
There's a lot of questions saying, how far along in this process did they get?
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Gensler, can you please provide some clarity as to how many times you met with SPF? Was there going to be a no action letter? The crypto industry has been calling for regulatory certainty and clarity, or at least a framework of some sorts. But you're going after Kim Kardashian and then potentially giving FTX a pass when actually Congress really couldn't see inside the books of FTX International or FTX US, unless there was like a subpoena, which again, at the time, they would have no reason to subpoena. But the SEC has that capability. And if they were having these talks and they were having some really in-depth talks about registering their exchange, they would have had the ability to go through not only FTX US, but FTX International. And there is precedent to do that before. So the question is, did the SEC screw up here? And they're the ones who to blame? Or were the conversations not progressed enough? And I think that kind of clarity and transparency is important. And we're going to get that pretty early on in 2023.
Yeah, that's a great point you brought up because the SEC, like you said, they have the power to do that. They were meeting with FTX officials, including Sam Bankman-Fried. So I think folks on the outside are, just as you said, the highlight of the year for the SEC is Kim Kardashian, while Celsius, FTX, Voyager, Terra Luna, billions of dollars lost with these massive whales and big firms in the industry. But Kim Kardashian.
Yeah, and to that point too, let's just take a step back for crypto regulation as a whole. Another interesting point, and I think again, I'm going to speculate a little bit here and say I believe, at least from what I'm seeing, Gary Gensler is losing a lot of favor with Democrats, and I think a glaring example of that too, also not just on the House side but the Senate side, is Sherrod Brown. Again, the man who's leading the committee that we just talked about in Senate Banking. He did a letter actually after the FTX fiasco broke the news, saying, "Dear Treasury, not SEC." Treasury, please come up with rules of how and legislative ideas of how to regulate crypto. Now, they CC'd a bunch of financial services agencies, the SEC, CFTC being two of them. But the letter was addressed to Treasury, was not addressed to the SEC. And the SEC has been saying for quite some time, we got this. This all is in our jurisdiction. We just need more funding. And that's what every agency does. They want to ask for funding. They want to make sure they can bolster up because a lot of them are stretched thin. So, I mean, it's very possible that the SEC is very stretched thin. At the same time, they're the ones telling Congress we don't need legislation. And I think Sherrod Brown saying, maybe we could, but I'm not going to ask the SEC this. And so when I talk about this narrative, also like no regulation needs to happen because we shouldn't legitimize it, I think that's something that could be coming from the SEC as well because they believe it's all in their jurisdiction. So regardless of what happens, I think there's a lot of things still in flux. But in my opinion, I think the SEC is losing a lot of favorability among their own party with the Democrats. And I think that's concerning, especially when they're going to have a split Congress and the SEC especially is going to be in the hot seat with House Republicans saying we want a lot more transparency.
For sure. And look, with all these hearings and all the dialogue back and forth, there's a lot happening. I know we've been talking about it. Most likely stablecoin regulations will get pushed through in 2023. But do you think there's a chance that, maybe a bill from Tom Emmer or Warren Davidson or somebody else, the Lummis Gillibrand bill could also get pushed through?
Yeah, I think we're getting pretty close to two situations. Either one situation is that we go through with some more small piecemeal bills we know have bipartisan support and can move. And I would say they're less controversial than many bills out there in Congress. So we can easily see a stablecoin bill get done on its own, potentially next year, in the early part of next year. We can see the same thing happen for like market structure, CFTC jurisdiction. So there's a lot of smaller bills we could do, clarification of what an NFT is. So that's one approach. You do small piecemeal bills, not as controversial, easy going through. The other angle is like a Dodd-Frank bill, the big, a bill to solve a major collapse. And as many folks are saying, take a big instance like Enron. After Enron, there was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. After the whole 2008 financial crisis, there was Dodd-Frank. some people are now starting to say, after FTX, what's that bill? We needed one big bill, and it needs to be heavy-handed, and we need to go regulate go after this industry pretty aggressively. And so some folks like Senator Lummis, for example, and Gillibrand saying, our bill already does that. You can go through our legislation. I don't think we're going to see that kind of bill move forward. I think we would see an aggressive bill put forward by the Senate Banking Committee. Chair Brown and Elizabeth Warren come to mind. But at the same time, we have a split Congress. And so Patrick McHenry in the House and Tom Emmer and Warren Davidson, all those guys, we're not going to let that go through in the House. And so they're going to have to work together. So I think the first strategy or the first approach of smaller bills makes more sense. But at the same time, we got to keep in consideration. I think Jake Auchincloss, from the Democrat from Massachusetts in the House, said this perfectly. He went on a 1-minute speech and basically said, crypto, as an industry, you guys got to get yourself together. At least from my perspective, Jake Auchincloss, I'm not seeing enough real use cases that affect the everyday American person. It might affect the tech world, it might affect the crypto community that you are all in, but I need to see why a single mother is utilizing this technology. And I think, again, that's incumbent on us, but that's incumbent on the industry to say, look, we need to make sure our use cases that are being described is real and tangible. He listed out every other sector that's been growing like crazy and says crypto was on that list of sectors that are going to do really, really well. I just have not seen it yet. He's been a big DeFi advocate, but we need to see those use cases percolate in the next year or two, or we can be in a lot of trouble, candidly.
Now we're approaching the end of the year. You got these hearings on FTX. Is there anything else scheduled, or it's pretty much done after these hearings, and then we'll look forward to January?
It's pretty much done. There's might be some chances that some small provisions get included into this big government spending bill. It tends to happen a lot, but I think it's going to be mostly on the tax stuff. Again, there's a lot that's happening behind the scenes, so we'll see even if it's remotely possible. And candidly, a lot of it's out of our control. It's more of just like, is the government going to shut down or not? And so we'll see if that happens. Again, so I want to say there's a chance that some small tax provisions on crypto get in there, and I'd say some of them to more beneficial actually for the everyday user, provide some clarity of what their tax status is. But if not, then I think early in 2023, McHenry said this is part one. I could see this at least probably 3 or 4 more hearings in the House. It's probably the same for the Senate. And it's going to be a hot topic. I think it's going to be probably the number 3 in terms of issues in all of Congress that's going to be taking the most bandwidth. And that's including healthcare and other big priorities that they're trying to get across the aisle, across the finish line by the end of next Congress. So we'll see, but the pressure's on. I'll tell you that.
Wow. Ron, always great information. Thank you, my friend.
Anytime. Happy to help.